for anyone that is watching, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Mark Blyth. I would try to remember your title, but I will definitely get it wrong. I know it's the 57 William Rhodes Scholar.
Heinz Beans Professor, 57
Yeah.
varieties, something like that.
Can you say it, please? Because you're used to saying it.
I am the William R. Rhodes 57 Professor of International Economics and Professor of International and Public Affairs at the Watson School for International Public Affairs at Brown University.
It's the longest title in academia.
I think it might be, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's totally ridiculous.
So I'm really, really grateful that you've agreed to do this. Again, I don't know why you do. I genuinely don't know why you do, but you do. So I'll take it.
It's your charm. It's all down to your charm. You just launch a charm offensive, and I have no way to this thing.
Well, I mean, if it works on economic professors, can we kind of figure out how to work on the fear of sex? Because that doesn't work at all. Right. So basically, when we chatted, which is now 2.5 years ago, I think.
Yeah, 2 years ago at least. Yeah.
We had a chat about what was kind of going off in the global economy, and now everything seems to have gotten much, much worse. So,
did you go back and listen? Were we at all right about some of the stuff we were saying, or were we miles off?
Yeah, no, we were. Well, you were. Obviously, I don't really know what I'm doing, but yeah, you were. And so I guess the first thing that I wanted to kind of ask and try and find out is, and this is a very broad question, what the fuck is going on? Is in like, everything seems to kind of be falling apart. So, inflation, we kind of had the transitory crew and it doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon.
Right.
Every other week we've got a new tariff, no tariff, an extra tariff. That's who knows what's happening there.
Mm-hmm.
And then on this side of the pond, which of course you are this side of the pond. So if people don't know, you're currently in Paris because you're going to go and tell someone that they need to do something. I don't know what.
Yes, exactly.
But on this side of the pond, we've now got Rachel Reeves kind of hunting down growth like it's Bigfoot, as though that's kind of going to be, the magic bullet. We just get some growth. Let's get some growth in, and then everything's going to be fixed. At the same time as potentially cutting money to the most vulnerable in society.
Yes.
And then we've got wealth taxes back on the kind of books with Gary Stevenson and patriotic millionaires, and there's that kind of growing call. So first off,
all right, let's start with inflation. Inflation, we had tariffs, we have growth, and we have wealth taxes. That's 4 things. You want to just go through those?
Yes, please.
Right. Okay,
so
let's get started.
What's the deal with tariffs, and why doesn't Donald Trump seem to understand how they work? Is everyone else wrong?
Start with inflation first, because that was last time we spoke. Inflation was just was the thing, right? So, book plug. I have a book coming out May the 6th called "Inflation: A Guide for Users and Losers," and I'll tell you what me and my co-author Nicola Fraccaroli say in the book about this thing. The basic thing is the team transitory were right. It's just a question of how long the transit is and the conditions of the transit. And here's what I mean by this. Standard stories about inflation are the government spent too much money, right? So there's too much money chasing too few goods, so you end up with inflation. Pretty simple stuff, right? Intuitive, makes sense. Republicans loved this one. It was Joe Biden's stimulus checks, all the rest of it. Most countries did not do stimulus checks. Most countries did spend to replace lost consumption, but less than they would have had there been no COVID. So if you're looking for Bigfoot there, you're probably not going to find it. What's the next one that you get? It's the labour market. The labour market's overheating. Well, that seems a strange one to argue and sent everybody home not to work. So that one's not going to be it, right? Despite the fact central banks do love those arguments and were, at least at the start of the pandemic, going through them quite systematically, right? The other one that came up was later on was it's all greedy corporations pushing things on. Basically, you've got your markup and you got your inflation hit, so your profits go down. So you've got to push back up to get there, and then that causes wages to go up, etc. The wage price spiral argument, and there was a lot of talk about that, and that didn't happen because basically wages did not catch up to inflation, so that couldn't be driving it. Were there a bunch of greedy corporations making out like proverbial bandits? Absolutely. In fact, in 2023, the European Central Bank said that 40% of the inflation of the Eurozone in 22 was literally price hike from corporations. So you've got some bit of Bigfoot there. And what was the other one? It was basically just supply shocks. It was the combination of the pandemic basically being a big supply shutdown, at the same time as everybody looked behind them on Zoom and said, Christ, I need to get a new couch. And we all tried to order a couch online at the same time. So you have a demand shock and a supply shock. And at the same time, you got that war in Ukraine that pushes up energy prices, particularly for energy importers. If you add together the greedy corporations, minor, and the supply shocks, major, you pretty much explain what happened. Now, with supply shocks, it's an interesting thing because you get a big impulse, things go up, and then after a while, the supply side adjusts, the pandemic's over, and it starts to come down. That's more or less what's happened. The reason things are still elevated is because we had a ridiculously low rate of inflation for 10 years prior to the pandemic, a combination of 600 million Chinese people joining the global labor market, pushing down prices, followed by quantitative easing, followed by the financial crisis, etc., etc. So actually having inflation at this rate historically is not actually that weird. Second thing is a whole bunch of stuff that we haven't done for years. Britain knows this in spades, which is a lack of housing. So your housing component right across countries where we just stopped building housing for normal people in 1980, that's become a big issue because the rents are high and then that shows up in the price index. And there's a few other things, particularly food and fuel, etc., which are still expensive. And that explains the stickiness in it. So basically that was where we got to with inflation. That's what caused it. And that's pretty much how I think about it.
Okay, so how does it kind of play out? Because at the moment, we keep seeing that kind of, in the UK, let's say, the inflation rate, yesterday we had CPI figures out that kind of it ticked down a touch.
What is it now in the UK?
So apparently it's 2.8.
Right, so it's less than 3.
But they're also, when we get this kind of ONS data out, it says that, inflation is, kind of 2.8. But in fact, it's fine because real wages have caught up and in fact exceeded. And yet, whenever you talk to anyone, everyone feels for it. Now, that could be a combination of, it's one of two things. Either they don't necessarily understand it. I don't think that's probably true because they're buying stuff in the day to day. Or they do understand it and they're going, right, who's got all these extra wages then?
Yeah, so I agree with all that, and there's just a simpler way to think about it still, which is the following. Nobody lives on an average, right? So John Otters, the journalist, kicked this off, and a few other people picked it up about a year ago. So when you put together price indices, which is how you tell the change in the rate of prices, right? That's what central banks, etc., do to calculate the rate of inflation. And one way to think about it is imagine a glass of water. Mm-hmm. So when the economics professional looks at a glass of water, they look at the surface tension, right? And when everybody else looks at a glass of water, they look at the glass of water. And what we look at is how thick or thin the surface tension is, because that's the rate of change. And what you care about is the fact that you used to pay half the glass for whatever you're buying, and now you pay nearly the full glass. The price level has shifted up, right? So first of all, they're looking at two different things. And the second thing about averages, what John did was he looked at what he called the anti-core. So there's this idea that you strip out things that are highly volatile and then you get a better look at what's really going on under the hood for inflation. The thing is, the stuff that's most volatile are food, rents, and fuel, which is about 60 to 80% of what people care about. So if you basically just look at them, the inflation, those three items, the inflation rate, the anti-core is much higher. Now, this matters because as you go across the income distribution, you consume less. I know this sounds weird to people, but bear with me, right? When we think about consumption baskets for inflation, what we're really talking about is, the stuff that you buy on a daily basis. So you got to pay your rent, you got to eat, you got to get to work, etc., etc. And if you are somebody below median income, that's a huge part of your expenditures. Like you will have 0.8 consumption and 0.2 savings, to be very simple about it, right? If you go up to the top 20%, it's 0.2 consumption and 0.8 savings. So therefore, inflation hits consumption goods. So who's actually feeling it? Well, you feel inflation differently across the income distribution, but there's less people the further up you go. So what you've got is a bunch of people like me at the top who never suffer inflation and in fact actually benefit from it in ways I can go on about if you want. And then you've got the vast majority of people who are like, what do you mean 3%? Everything costs 10% more at least. And they're not wrong. It's because none of us live on the average, which is the sum of those expectations and the sum of those changes represented in a number.
So one of the reasons, presumably, that you don't feel it and people right at the top don't feel it is because, I suppose a couple of reasons. Presumably, if you're at the top, you're probably not paying rent, you're probably paying a mortgage, or indeed if you
Correct.
have a mortgage. But also, if you've got an inflation rate, then that's eating away at your mortgage.
Correct, exactly.
And
So
also,
if I've
because
got
people
if
at
I
the
have
top,
fixed rate debt, if I have fixed
sorry.
rate debt, then basically inflation is giving me money back in real terms because I'm paying back the loan in devalued units of currency. Definitely. I'll give you another one. This is my favorite one from this. We snuck it in the book at the end. In 2020, American carbon majors, right, the big oil companies, made 220 billion in extra profits, okay, over their baseline. So where do those profits go? Well, most of them go to shareholders. So let's take half that number, because half of that gets disbursed as dividends and also shows up in the share price. Who owns that? The top 1% of Americans. So 3.3 million Americans got $110 billion just from their shareholdings in oil companies during the pandemic. That's a lot of cash. Given the fact that those people do not consume very much as a proportion of their income, whatever they felt in inflation was more than compensated for by the increase in the shares and the dividend payments they got from them. Now, if you don't have those things, you don't benefit from it. And that's why the experience of inflation varies widely across the income distribution.
And so, of course, that kind of leads on to, I mean, maybe we'll come on to this in a second, but that then kind of leads on to this whole thing about kind of wealth inequality and driving wealth inequality, which is getting worse over time.
Yes, it is. I mean, we have the wealthiest guy in the world basically hacking away at the state. I mean, this is unprecedented levels of both power and influence and just the fact of wealth inequality.
So where does the kind of inflation story go from here then? Do you think? I mean, do we ever get below 2% anytime soon, or does it? At some point, is deflation going to kick in? Where does this end?
Well, it ends when it ends, but we're never going back to zero because that was all basically central bank manipulation following the financial crisis. So get used to positive inflation. As simple as that. And this is why, Rachel Reeves' pursuit of growth actually isn't actually a foolish thing. Because if you're growing at 3 and inflation's 2, you're fine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And historically, economies like the UK used to grow around at least 2.5%, that sort of stuff. It had inflation just below that. So if you're doing that and you've got positive real wage growth, then over time your debts, you can. It's not that inflation's eating away your debts. Basically, what happens is you're just earning more than your debts are. So the rate of growth in your debts is lower than the rate of growth in your income. So if you get back to that's fantastic. The problem is Britain hasn't seen any since 2008, which says something that's deeply wrong about Britain's sort of operative model and its business model. I'm happy to talk about that if you want, but essentially, it's not mad to do this because what's the alternative? The alternative is just to sit around and get poorer, right? So that's it.
So on that, there's basically there's 3 things, isn't there? There's the rate of growth, the rate of inflation, and the rate of the interest on your debt.
Yes.
And basically, as long as you've got the right numbers on the numerator and the operator, numerator and the denominator,
Yeah.
as long as they're in the right proportion, it doesn't really matter. So it was one of these things that kind of gets blown around in the media, particularly in the UK, and I'm sure it does in the US as well, which is why you've got this Doge thing and him jumping about with a chainsaw looking like a nutter. But it's basically everyone kind of gets really worked up about public debt. But in fact, as long as it's shrinking as a share of GDP, you don't actually have to pay it back. So people are getting really worked up about, because we're kind of around 100% debt to GDP, but seem to forget that
it's a big scary number. Yeah, it's a big scary number, absolutely. But I mean, the underlying problem is exactly as you said. Look, if you put debt on the bottom and you put the size of your economy on the top, imagine they're 100 and 100, right? And let's say that we do Doge and we cut 20% of all spending, which is 40% of government spending, right? 50% of government spending, and you get to 80 over 100, right? What you've basically done is make your debt bigger as a proportion of your overall economy. So what you want to do is the other one. You want to go to 120 over 100, and that way it's 80%, and then it's much more manageable. So that's why basically growing the numerator becomes really, really important for doing this and not being shrunk by the denominator through cuts. Unfortunately, Britain's in a really strange position with this one. I don't think that the country's going bankrupt. Countries that don't borrow foreign currencies don't go bankrupt because the promise that you've made to pay the bond can only be redeemed in cash. And we can give you any type of cash you want. So you might not want the cash, and people might freak out and dump the currency, and then that leads to your exchange rate falling. That leads to your imports. Britain's very import dependent, getting much more expensive. Ultimately, you can have a really bad balance of payments crisis. Loads of bad things can happen, but you can't actually go bankrupt. So that's kind of an important one when people say this, right? But a lot of things, like the way that Britain funded its long-term debt over the decade leading after the financial crisis, we had a period of negative interest rates. We had 5 or 6 years negative interest rates. We should have basically re-auctioned the entire debt stock and locked in it a negative real yield. We could have done that. Didn't do this. Blame the government of the day. The way that COVID spending was done, both in the US and the UK, was with a lot of short-term debt. Well, the short-term debt comes due. And then because of inflation, people want inflation premium to basically re-up the debt again. And that's why you get these very high headline numbers. At the same time, however, it's not as if the entirety of the UK debt stock comes at once and it's all due at the highest possible interest rate. It's not. Are there fiscal pressures in the sense that the share of GDP going to interest payments is going up? Absolutely. Was that because you could have really smoothed the maturities of the debt and done a better job? Yes, but we didn't. So that's the end of it. Does this mean that Rachel Reeves actually has a problem now in terms of if you want to reboot the economy? And there's a lot of stuff that you need to do that, a lot to do with planning, regulations, the inability to build anything. My favourite story on this is the £100 million bat shed to do with HS2.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy,
It's
isn't it?
absolutely bonkers, right? So there's a lot of these stuff that, like, I think there's quite good cross-party agreement on, right? But we also have an aging population. We also have a population of people who have long COVID, particularly in the UK, right? And the notion that everyone who is claiming these benefits is a malingerer, etc., is rubbish, right? It's not. But at the same time, if they don't do something to free up something on the public balance sheet, they won't get growth, and then we won't get back to that situation whereby the numerator is bigger than the denominator, in which case you're just slowly getting worse and worse and poorer. So they're faced, and it's not their fault, they inherited it from the government from before. But they've been dealt a shitty bunch of cards, and now they're going to try and figure the way out of it.
Now, of course, mentioning that the cuts to, for example, disabled people, PIP benefits, and all that kind of stuff, which was on in the spring statement yesterday. Now, isn't it true that there's always going to be someone swinging the lead, right? There's always that's always been the case, no matter where you look, and no matter what you do, there's always going to be someone that falls through that cracks and is able to exploit it. But I don't think personally that there's that many. Actually, when you kind of dig into the data, it doesn't seem as though there's that many actually taking the mickey. But isn't the case that if you start cutting money from people there, where it's at the lower end of the income distribution, then you're basically also cutting your income as a country, because those people will spend most of what they have, and therefore you're taking money out of their pockets. You're then also making all the people that provide their services, goods, and all the rest of it poorer, aren't you?
That is 100% true, and you cause a lot of personal and sort of general social misery in the process. But the rhetorical point, which is also a factual point, is you've lost about 2 million people from your labour market, and somehow you've got to increase labour participation rates. Now, the other way of doing this is immigration, but that has been politicised to the point that that's never going to work again. Plus, you did Brexit, so you can't no longer bring in people from Europe. And also, because you're outside the single market, you actually have a much smaller market to grow in now, at a time when your biggest customer is pushing up tariffs, and there will be reciprocal tariffs because of that all around the world. So the world that Britain imagined itself to be entering in 2016, this global Britain, where we're going to be this free trade powerhouse, it was a fantasy then, but it's a double fantasy now. And what's happened is, where the combination of COVID expenditure, how it was financed, and then the knock-on effects on this in the labour market, Britain's in a bad place. And it's basically figure out some way of rebooting the economy.
So this is one of the things I was going to ask, actually, is exactly that. So kind of we're struggling with labour market participation. We're struggling with kind of paying our debt levels, etc. We've got a ballooning state. I mean, the civil service is significantly bigger now than than it was in 2019. No one's really seen an improvement in any kind of efficiency. Right. But we've got this giant elephant sat in the room. They're going, okay, so we need, for example, if you want to build all these homes, well, we need brickies and plumbers and plasterers and carpenters and all the rest of it. And we need people to come in and work in the care sector. And clearly Britain has turned a bit of a corner in terms of a lot of people do seem to not like people that aren't white. Not everyone, of course. I'm not saying that everyone's racist or anything like that. But we do seem to have shifted that way.
You had very, very high levels of immigration from non-traditional immigration countries, and these people end up in it's basically what are not rich people's neighborhoods, and they notice it. It has an effect on rents. It has an effect on the tone of politics, and that's something that's true right across the world. One of the things that I find most frustrating at the current moment is the complete inability of progressive and left parties to even talk about immigration. This is a real concern of people because they're the people who see this, feel it, deal with it, etc. They're the people you want to vote for you, but the minute they raise the topic, you're like, oh no, we can't talk about that. You're just a racist. I just find it absolutely astonishing.
Yeah, and so the big thing there is we need all these skilled people. There's certain types of immigration that we would accept, and there's a great big market right on our doorstep. Yet no one wants to actually acknowledge that we could solve a lot of these problems in one fell swoop by going, okay, let's have a bit of customs union and single market, please. And it seems as though the current incumbent political people, they're scared to death of Farage, of Badenoch, of Truss. I mean, she keeps yapping, even though she's not a politician anymore. But no one wants to actually just acknowledge we can solve a majority of these problems. It's not going to solve everything overnight, but it would go a long way through, wouldn't it?
I totally agree, but it's off the table. I mean, this is the rock and the hard place. You imagine yourself part of a global Britain free trading crusader, and it's just that role is no longer there and available. It's been taken off the table. So anyway, if you don't have market access to a bigger market and everybody else is tariffing, you're back to square one in that regard. So there's only one place to go. So let's go for it, which is wealth taxes. Why don't we go for the wealthy? So a couple of issues with this. The first one is it's hard to basically figure out exactly how much wealth there is. It's all in the accounting for it, literally. Then there's accountancy, which is basically the science of not paying taxes. And you can get very, very good at that. My favorite example that most people probably don't know is that seriously rich people don't have any income, right? Yeah. Because what you do is you have assets. So like if I'm Jeff Bezos, I take 20 million Amazon shares and I use that as collateral on a loan, and then I live off the loan, and you don't pay any taxes on loan income. So my tax rate went down from whatever it be, 30% or more, to whatever the loan rate is. And given that I'm a prime borrower, it's probably 3 or 4%. So you add inflation into this, I don't pay any taxes just by that one move. And there's billions of scams. Once you get above 50 million quid a year, the entire legal profession, basically, that's what they do. They enable you not doing this. So finding this and doing it is actually a difficult thing. Second thing with it, a lot of these things aren't liquid. So let's say, for example, you just go on a mansion tax and you start taxing people. I'm in favor of that. I think there's diminishing returns because ultimately what you end up doing is you will end up with a lot of people selling these mansions all at once to avoid the tax, which is fine because then maybe the price falls and we can turn those mansions into flats. And then you'd actually do something on your housing crisis. Yeah, but only at the margin, right? So, Thomas Kerry for a long time has wanted an 80% global wealth tax on the grounds that, if you take a good example, is Bezos, right? If Bezos loses 99% of his 99% of his wealth, he's still worth $2 billion, right? So there's a lot up there. Okay, if you do that, you would need the cooperation of every country in the world to make it happen. So there's loads of reasons why people don't try and do this. Countries that have done this, Switzerland has done this, Sweden tried it at one point. They tend not to raise nearly as much money as they actually think that they're going to. Yeah. So that's not a panacea either, unfortunately.
So why is it the case then that, for example, there was a poll done at Davos. I mean, I don't know how accurate these are, but by reputable polling companies, and again, even the reputable ones, how accurate they are. But there's kind of been polls done where even the wealthy are saying we should probably pay a bit more of a share. There's a great talk by Nick Hanauer, TED Talk in 2014, that basically says, and it kind of comes back to your, the Hamptons is not a defensible position. So even though wealth taxes are difficult to do, it's pretty tricky to kind of establish who has what and who owns what because all these opaque structures around the world. What is the alternative? Because at the moment, it doesn't really see, there isn't really that much of another way around it. As in, like, Henry Ford kind of knew, didn't he, that the way to sell his products was to increase the wage of everyone because then everyone's got some more money, and if you invigorate the middle class, that they're the people that drive growth because they're the people that consume stuff. Like,
Right.
if I'm a billionaire, I can only eat 3 meals a day.
Yeah.
Right?
There's only one Sub-Zero fridge you can buy for 15,000 quid. Right.
Yeah.
Done.
Yeah.
Right.
Whereas, if 50,000 people are eating an additional 3 meals a day because they can all of a sudden go out and afford to do that, that does drive growth, and that's beneficial to the people at the top. So, one of the things that I do find interesting with regards to the wealth taxes is not that it's difficult or all that kind of stuff, but it's the way it's positioned as though it's inherently some kind of Marxist or communist idea. When in
Right.
fact, it purely just take the kind of moral aspect away from it, that we've got kids with rickets while someone else has got their fifth
Right.
jet. So take the moral argument out of it. But the whole thing of, if people have got more money to spend and higher wages, then we can buy more, and then the people at the top, funnily enough, end up with the biggest increasing. So the percentage that they totally own might come down, but the number's still rising. They're not doing bad out of it.
No, I mean, all of that is true. I mean, these days it's slightly more complex in the fact that, given 4 decades of economic integration at a global level, if you basically give everybody an extra 10% on their income, you might end up generating an extra 10% in imports because you don't make the stuff yourself, right?
Yeah.
And while that'd be good for somebody on the other side of the world, it's not a direct benefit to you in the same way, because if you do, then you could have a balance of payments issue and so on and so forth. So it's a bit more complex than the old closed economy models, as we call it, right? But nonetheless, the principle is sound. Yeah, I mean, it's also, I mean, part of it goes along with a bunch of other stuff that's non-economic. I mean, basically, we live in different information bubbles. We look at the same information and see 2 or 3 different things depending on the filter that's put on it. And those information bubbles are deftly manipulated by the people who happen to be the richest people in society. Why? Because they're the ones that run all the digital platforms. So, there's a reason that sort of like, don't think about this, look over here. If you look over there, you're a Marxist, right? So these filters are out there for a reason, because they're very beneficial to the people who are wielding the filters. So, it's a large part of it is, the rest is politics, as they say somewhere.
Well, but this is the thing, right? So this is one of the kind of parts of where this entire kind of Rachel Reeves growth thing, I just find it a bit disingenuous, in so much as, back in the Industrial Revolution, we owned the vast part of the world, and we plundered both human and natural capital.
Yep.
Some people sink a bin, and yet the vast majority of people lived in abject poverty. So this idea that growth just miraculously raises people out of poverty, I'm not saying it doesn't, because clearly economic growth is beneficial to generate, kind of rising tide. But the idea that it will benefit people disproportionately at the bottom, like kind of some kind of John Rawls, veil of ignorance maximin type thing, is basically bullshit, right? As in, the people at the top capture most of it. So
yeah, it depends. Yeah, I mean, again, it depends on how you structure or how you allow growth to occur, in a sense, right? If growth is growth in share prices, you're benefiting the top 10%, and that's how it shows up. So, one of the interesting ones over here is pundits are now like, it turns out Trump doesn't really care about the stock market. Well, Trump doesn't really care about the stock market because, Trump and all of his ilk can basically deal with a 30% drawdown in the stock market. Just not going to bother them at all. And most people will suffer if those firms go bankrupt because they'll no longer work for them, but they don't own shares, right? So why should you? So it depends on what your marker of growth is. I mean, I think that what Reeves and others are talking about is essentially non-inflationary real wage growth. That's what we need to get. We need to get wages up. And you can do a lot of that by, passing a law and increasing a minimum wage and so on and so forth. And whether they've reached the limits or that, I haven't thought through the numbers enough to think about it. Maybe more could be done on that side. But at the same time, every time you raise the minimum wage, you're basically saying to someone who runs a small business who's probably on really tight margins, you need to generate more or you need to take less, right? It's got to come from somewhere. Yeah. So growth, regardless, unless we're going to advocate for going back to imperialism, because that was the way that we used to square that circle. Remember Joseph Chamberlain's social imperialism at the turn of the 20th century, right? We will pay the workers off with the profits of plundering everybody else. So unless, and you could think about Trump's tariffs basically as a version of that. Unless you want to go back to that, then it has to be some kind of growth within the country in real wages. And we used to be really good at that. It used to be pretty good. I mean, you go back to the 1990s, real wage growth was pretty good. That was cool Britannia. That's when people had money to spend, right? You go back even in the 1960s and 70s, it's the same. So we've had periods where this has happened. What has also tended to happen, though, is that those have been periods where we've had new kind of technological waves that have become established technologies that give mass employment. So whether it was sort of factory employment post World War II, whether it was the shift into banking, insurance, services, etc., in the 1980s, powering the 1990s, once that business model kind of goes bang in 2008, you've kind of hollowed out, same with the United States, and this is a lot to do with the populist reaction. You've hollowed out large parts of the country, and this is something we haven't done before, right? So one way to think about it is this, right? What was the relation back in the day between Bolton, Birmingham, and London? Well, they all kind of needed each other. So Birmingham was the workshop, Bolton was the parts supplier, London was the banker, insurer, and shipper. What happens now? London cares more about what happens in Paris and Amsterdam than it does about Birmingham or even Bolton. Right. So I went back to Dundee, my hometown, in the summer for the first time in 20 years. And I was shocked, literally shocked. I was so shocked I wrote to Gordon Brown and just went, what the hell happened? And he's done a report on how far Scotland has fallen as well. And it's basically because there hasn't been any real wage growth in 20 years.
Yeah.
So when you go up, the posh high street that we used to have in Dundee still have what's called Reform Street. And when I was growing up in the 1980s, I remember this is the 80s when things were pretty rough, right? Relatively high unemployment. But you went out on a Saturday night, everything was banging, every bar was full, people had money to spend, etc. And this street had solicitors' offices, restaurants, and so on, and all that sort of like high-end stuff, right? Walked up Reform Street with my brother. There was a Turkish barber, a Kurdish barber, a tanning salon, a tattoo parlor, and every other shop was boarded up. Now, once you've done that degree of damage, there's no magic wand for getting it back. It needs a thorough reboot at every level of society. And we've got to free up much, much more investment to do this. To go back to, I think a lot of stuff goes through housing. If you solve the housing crisis, you solve your labour crisis. Because like you say, you've got to train the HVAC guys, you've got to train the sparkies, the whole thing. And when you do that, you also solve your labour mobility problem because people can't afford to go where there are jobs because it's so bloody expensive because it's all in the southeast. So you could start to actually regionalize and have, better connectivity, better labour mobility, more investment in the northern cities, etc. There's a path to doing this, and then I think that they're taking some tentative steps to do this. But as you say, they're afraid of their own fiscal shadow. So, what are they doing? They're doubling down on essentially trying to find pennies when they need pounds.
So, just to throw something out there, because this kind of, again, it's something that's gaining popularity and is becoming cool again, I suppose. And I don't know if it ever wasn't cool or what, but there seems to be a lot of talk of it, and that's land value tax and a bit of Georgism.
Yeah, and I've yet to hear an argument about why this is a bad idea.
But how would it? How could it be implemented? For example, it works in Texas, right?
Apparently, I mean, again, this is like not something that I've spent a great deal of time thinking about. But anytime I've read about it, I've gone, it's kind of a neat idea. I mean, the basic principle is that it's just a rent, right? In the sense that you're getting income, you didn't do anything with investment to earn. So it's simply the appreciation value of the land. So one of the richest guys in the United Kingdom is the Duke of Westminster or the Duke of Buckingham. I forget what it is.
Yeah, Westminster.
He owns Knightsbridge and all this sort of stuff. And I think it was his mob that were the inventors of the whole leasehold versus freehold thing, right? So you get a 99-year lease and it still reverts back to these guys, right? So when you have those types of property structures, what you're doing is you're setting up what economists call rents, not the rent you pay, but essentially income that you're going to get simply because of some kind of legal or other barrier. And it's something that the right usually goes on about, but there's no reason for it to be associated with the right. It's a general thing that when you have markets that work with less rent barriers, then everybody benefits. Simple as that. So going after sort of land values and a land value tax and appreciation on land values is one way of not only doing something about housing, because you can then actually do something about land prices, which is a large part of that, but it definitely will raise revenue. However, you're going to be going after some of the most powerful and rich people in your country who are your landowning classes. And if you want to have a look at what that looks like, Brett Christophers, who's a brilliant economic geographer, who's a British guy, Crystal Palace fan actually, who lives in Sweden. And who lives in Sweden, wrote a series of books, and the first one from 2016, it's called something like Who Owns Britain or something like that. It's very simple, but he essentially goes and finds out who owns this stuff, and it's incredible. You just got to read this book. This Britain is not what you think it is. But the Georgia's land tax stuff. I mean, I think it's why not? Particularly in places where people have just been coining it for 300 years simply because they sit on a bit of dirt.
Yeah, and moreover, not only do they just sit on the land, but they normally took it by force. But that's a whole different argument.
Yeah, I mean, let's not go there at this point. So look, here's one that a mate of mine sent me the other day. He goes, "Do you know that it's actually the case that the United Kingdom, about the United Kingdom Slavery Payoff Act in 1834 or whatever it was?" Yeah. And I says, "No, I can't say that I've actually spent a lot of time looking at it." And he goes, "You know that we didn't pay off the final tranche of the debt until 2016." And I was like, "Oh. Doesn't surprise me." And he's like, "Well, why doesn't that surprise you?" And he says, "Because ultimately the size of the economy 100 years later, 150 years later, whatever it is going to be much, much bigger. So that 30% of GDP that you took out to spend all that becomes 3% and becomes 1%. And if you run it out to infinity, then basically it's not even pennies on the pound. It's not even a rounding error on the budget. That's exactly how you use it, right?" And then he said to me, "So why is the government incapable of thinking that way these days?" And I was like, "That's a really good point. Right? Why aren't we incapable of doing it?" And part of this has to do with the sort of the public's fear and the public's interpreted fear of this thing called the bond market, right? That when you have 100% debt to GDP, if you're issuing 20, 30% more, the markets will never tolerate it. Well, they probably will, but they probably want a higher interest payment, and they'll probably want a shorter maturity. So, the ability to do that type of stuff when you are already quite heavily indebted is a little bit more constrained. But it does raise the question of there are other things we could do rather than the playbook that we've got just now. And when we managed to get rid of, basically, we bought off Britain's slave-owning aristocracy with the public purse in a way that people didn't even notice. So, isn't there more that could be done for the here and now?
So, I mean, this is kind of going back in time. With hindsight, everything's fantastic. But I was messaging someone earlier, basically along the lines of talking about the bond market and how we do clearly need infrastructure investment. We do need to do all these things.
Totally.
But why do we have a political class that missed this? For example, when bond yields were basically zero and probably negative real during the pandemic, why didn't we just go, right? Let's get 5 trillion quid in.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I couldn't agree more.
But why do we have these people that don't? I mean, I'm a mortgage broker, for God's sake. I was screaming at the sky during COVID, like, why are we not doing that? So if I can compete, surely the people that are actually trained in this stuff, or what's that all about?
I mean, it's a really good question why the Bank of England decided to fund COVID through short-term financing. I mean, I really don't understand why they made that choice. Unless they basically wanted to put a constraint in there because you don't want to tell the government that, like, when you really have to do things, you can do things, because that might unsettle the gilt market or however they think about it. I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, they're missed opportunities. I mean, I'm a big advocate for decarbonisation. I think it's 100% necessary. And during the 2010s, we could have financed all that at a negative real rate. And once again, we forgot to do it. A lot of that has to do with the fact that you had a terrible government for a very long time. I mean, you might not be impressed with the Labour bench now, but you have to remember the clown car that you had for a long time, right? Yeah. Particularly Cameron, right? It was just pretty awful. So, you have short-termism, you have infighting, you have people that don't really have their eye on the long term, and also the legacy that comes out of the Blair years of essentially the public-private partnerships. I mean, you're still giving public money that you supposedly can't find for other things to the people running your infrastructure who have broken it, run it into the ground, and extracted rents from it for over 20 years. Thames Water is just one of those examples. Then add to the fact that you have an entire industry based around the comment that you're meant to give on environmental impacts and health and safety and everything to do with any proposed development, all of which has to be paid for the developer. And then you end up with ludicrous development costs, which is your HS2 story. There's a whole bunch of things that have accumulated over time that just make it really, really hard and really expensive to do things. And that really has to change.
So what could the business model be? What if you, for example, let's say you're in a lift with Rachel Reeves and you've got this kind of lingering stench of QE.
Domestic, dead easy.
What would you do?
Domestically. So let's start. I'm just going to make this up as I go along, but it'd be something like this. You've got to start doing land taxes, and you've got to do heavy land reform, and you've got to go really, really heavy against basically that entire lobby. Once you free this up, you've got to reboot your technical colleges. You went far too long on people doing degrees at universities of 3 years at college studying anything at all automatically gets you a job. That's simply no longer the case. We need HVAC, we need Sparkies, we need people that can actually build things. That's your domestic reboot. That's going to impact a whole bunch of sectors over time and actually boost wages and do a whole bunch of stuff. Your international stuff is you've got to get single market access again. You've got to get back in there. And you don't have to go back in with Schengen because it looks like Schengen, the free movement of people's on its way out anyway, for different reasons. And also the security build-up that everyone is involved in now. The Germans have got rid of the debt break, etc. Being part of that now when Europe's about to go on a very heavy growth spurt would be really, really good idea for Britain because there's a lot that Britain exports over there in terms of both services and also in terms of defence contractors and things like this. So getting back into a bigger market so you can take advantage of that would be the external side of that. And the third one would be bandwagoning completely with Europe rather than with the US, because the US is going to play you off against Europe. And you'll probably get away with not having any tariffs or having less than they do as the reward. But the long-term consequence of that is you're just going to be utterly dependent on a country that is very, very fickle and doesn't really give two craps about you. So where do you want to go? And that's what I would tell her to do in an elevator if we got 3 minutes.
That sounds. I mean, to be fair, that seems like good ideas. So on that then, that kind of
one thing, mate. I've got to get downstairs in half an hour for this.
So
we're going to wrap up in 5, right?
Yeah. So the last one is then what's going off with tariffs? What is that all about?
Oh God, in 5 minutes. In my opinion, this is not partly it's a part of it is the grift. Part of it is watch what all these people around Trump and the Trump family, etc., are doing with crypto. The crypto reserve, they're about to launch their own stable coin. They're about to launch their own ETF. I mean, the huge part of this is just a grift. But the big ambition on this essentially is a global reordering. And the way I've spoke about this, you can find me on NPR on the US talking about this sort of stuff, is for the longest time, the United States has essentially paid its way in the world after the 1980s by the following trick. So you move your plant and equipment out to China, you send your stuff back to Walmart. Walmart basically then sends dollars to China. I'm simplifying, right? Could be anywhere. Yeah. Those export countries could be Germany. They don't want dollars circulating in their own country because they don't use dollars. But if they converted them into huge gobs of domestic currency and then spent it, then it would be inflationary. And that would mean prices and wages go up. People would be happier, but nonetheless, your BMWs would cost more. So you suppress prices and wages. You basically don't allow that money to circulate. Now you have an asset liability mismatch because you've got cash that you can't use. So what do? You turn that into a treasury bill. You turn that into American debt because it's deep and it's liquid. It gives you 2.5% to 3% usually, and that's essentially handing the money back to the Americans that they just gave you to pay for their stuff, and that lowers our interest rates and allows us to play the same trick again. Now the problem with this over the long term is you just end up hollowing out your entire economy. And a good example of this, the top 3 employers in the United States in 1975, before we started all this stuff, were Exxon, General Motors, and Ford. The top 3 employers today are Walmart, Amazon Logistics, and Home Depot. So it just tells you what's happened to the economy. So why are you putting up tariffs? Because you really are quite serious about rebalancing this. And that means that the exporters need to export less, so you tariff them. That means they have to consume more or produce less surplus. And then at the same time, you repatriate your supply chains and build stuff at home. Is this likely to succeed? No, for lots of reasons I can give you, but that's the direction of travel, and that's why we're seeing a lot of stuff on tariffs.
Right, so the last bit, and then I'll let you get going and do your thing that you need to do in Paris. One of the things I've said to a few people is that I'm concerned about young people getting on the housing market, and everyone is, right? Because prices are crazy, wages are crap.
And you don't have enough houses.
Yeah, we don't have enough houses. And someone kind of pulled me up because I said, look, I was saying, I'm trying to get this thing out that basically if you don't buy now, you never will. That sounds like a bit of a grift because it sounds like, it's kind of, but the real reason behind it is that's why I worry, because I don't think we will fix these things that you've talked about. I don't think that will happen. And therefore, it kind of is imperative that if you're going to do this, you probably should do it sooner rather than later. It doesn't mean today, and it doesn't mean next week, but
Right.
you should probably do it sooner rather than later. Because unless we do this, am I right in thinking that house prices will continue to increase? It will continue to get worse, and we're just going to end up as a more unequal society in the next kind of 5 years, because the stuff that you've talked about is probably not going to happen.
I'm not quite as pessimistic. I actually think that these things do have a tendency to work their way out. So let's think about it this way. Has Trump been effective in getting exporters to rebalance? Well, combination of him and Putin got the Germans to abandon the debt brake and agree to spend $1 trillion that they should have spent over the past 10 years but haven't. And that's going to have a quite a large, boosting effect to German economy and so on and so forth, right? So, events, dear boy, events, things that happen that impress upon you the need to change. Britain has allowed itself to become basically sort of, for all the reasons we're talking about, a place where it's really hard to get positive real wage growth, right? Have we had that in the past? Yes. Can we get that again? Absolutely. So it's a question of sort of allowing, a combination of those events to work through and hopefully have governments that are able to direct what investment they have into areas that actually matter. And ultimately being commit to certain things, like in this instance, just building more houses. I mean, I think so much of the British problem goes through houses and goes through skills. And if we can just redirect our efforts that way, a lot of problems will sort of get better in this regard. The downside of this, of course, is that if you're part of the homeowning class of the UK that since the mid 1980s onwards has had a real rate of return almost as good as if you'd owned the S&P in the United States over the same period. Are they going to be pissed if lots of new houses show up? Maybe, but again, it's very different housing stock. You're going to be building starter homes, you're going to be building apartments, you're going to be building apartment complexes, you're going to be building the type of things that younger people actually want and that you're able to provide. So there doesn't even have to be direct conflict against this. So overall, I'm not dreadfully pessimistic. I've never been someone who's like this. This is why I had to leave Scotland. I'm actually far too optimistic for a Scotsman.
So in fact, to bring it to a close then, there is a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel.
There is, and it's not an on-rushing train. I mean, ultimately, it's, what's happening now is that Trump and the forces around Trump have decided to break the order that we've been in for the past 40 years. I'd like to remind everyone that a great many of us have been complaining incessantly about that order for the past 40 years, and now it's been broken, we're complaining about this. So, we've got to think about what we actually want and where we think we're going, and try and intervene in the ways we think are the most useful in doing so.
Excellent. Well, on that note, I'll say thank you very much for joining me, Dr. Blyth. I'm going to chuck, not in some kind of affiliate weird thing, but I'm going to pop in below the links to your books: Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea. Just
do the inflation one. That'd be great.
The inflation one. All right, I'll do the inflation.
Yeah, just do that one because it's coming out in May, so that'd be great.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you so much for this today. I really, really appreciate it. Have a great time in Paris and go tell the people what they need to do.